Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
There comes a moment in a man's life when lust stops feeling like power, when attention stops feeling like love, when control stops feeling like strength. And in that silence, something deeper begins to stir. Because the divine masculine does not awaken when he is praised, chased, or constantly desired. He awakens when he is confronted by truth. The kind of truth that strips away illusion, breaks old patterns, and forces him to see the man he has become. What if intimacy was never just about closeness? What if it was a mirror? What if the very moments that made him feel exposed, rejected, humbled, or emotionally undone were actually the moments trying to wake his soul up? In this video, we will uncover 7 intimate truths that shake the masculine out of emotional sleep and call him back to depth, discipline, purpose, and sacred love. Because the man who awakens is not the man who knows how to possess. He is the man who finally learns how to protect, lead, feel, and transform. Chapter 1. The hidden crisis of the sleeping masculine. There is a crisis few people know how to name. It does not always look dramatic. It does not always appear as failure. In fact, sometimes it hides behind success, charm, ambition, confidence, discipline, and even admiration. It can wear a nice suit. It can build a business. It can attract attention. It can speak with certainty and move through the world with a powerful presence. And still, beneath all of that, something essential can remain asleep. This is the hidden crisis of the sleeping masculine. It is the condition of a man who has learned how to function, but not how to feel deeply. A man who knows how to achieve, but not how to connect. A man who can command respect in public, yet feels strangely lost in private. A man who has mastered the art of appearing strong, while quietly running from the very truths that could make him whole. This is not about shaming men. It is not about attacking masculinity. It is about rescuing it. Because the divine masculine is not toxic. It is not cruel. It is not numb. It is not performative. It is not obsessed with domination, image, conquest, or control. The divine masculine is sacred leadership. It is disciplined presence. It is emotional steadiness. It is truth lived with courage. It is strength that protects rather than intimidates. It is depth without confusion. It is power without corruption. But many men never meet this version of themselves. Instead, they inherit fragments. From childhood, many boys are taught the outer shell of manhood long before they are taught the soul of it. They are told to be tough, but not tender, to be strong, but not sensitive, to win, but not to wonder, to suppress tears, hide fear, and keep moving no matter what is bleeding inside. They learn very early that certain emotions are acceptable and others are dangerous. Anger may be tolerated. Confidence may be rewarded. But grief, insecurity, softness, confusion, longing, and vulnerability are often treated like weaknesses to be hidden. So the boy begins to split himself in two. There is the self he shows the world, and the self he buries underground. Over time, he becomes skilled at this division. He learns to perform. He learns to adapt. He learns to survive by becoming what others admire, what others fear, what others desire, or at the very least, what others cannot wound easily. He may become hyper-independent. He may become emotionally unavailable. He may become addicted to achievement, validation, distraction, or constant motion. He may tell himself he is simply focused, simply private, simply driven, simply realistic. But deep down, what he calls control may actually be avoidance. What he calls strength may actually be emotional exile. What he calls freedom may actually be fear of intimacy. And this is where the sleeping masculine begins. Not in evil, not in weakness, but in disconnection. A disconnected man is not necessarily a bad man. Sometimes he is thoughtful, generous, hardworking, loyal, and full of good intentions. But because he is disconnected from his own inner life, he lives from instinct instead of truth. He reacts instead of reflects. He seeks relief instead of transformation. He reaches for attention instead of meaning. He confuses desire with love, silence with peace, and emotional distance with maturity. He may not even realize it. That is what makes this crisis so dangerous. It is subtle. The sleeping masculine can look composed while living in inner chaos. It can look successful while starving spiritually. It can look masculine while being deeply afraid of the very essence of mature manhood. And what is that mature essence? Responsibility. Not just financial responsibility. Not just external responsibility. Inner responsibility. The responsibility to face one's wounds without making them everyone else's burden. The responsibility to tell the truth, even when it exposes weakness. The responsibility to lead one's own mind instead of being ruled by impulse. The responsibility to stay present in moments that challenge the ego. The responsibility to become trustworthy, not just impressive. This is where many men struggle, because it is far easier to build an image than a soul. An image can be polished. A soul must be purified. An image asks, how do I appear? A soul asks, who am I when nobody is watching? An image wants admiration. A soul wants alignment. An image fears being exposed. A soul longs to be made real. And so many men live trapped in performance. They build identities around what can be measured. Money, physique, status, sexual attention, influence, social approval. None of these things are inherently wrong. The issue begins when they become substitutes for inner grounding. Because when a man does not know himself, he will try to possess things that make him feel like someone. He will chase what stimulates him because he has lost touch with what anchors him. He will pursue women, applause, results, and recognition, hoping one of them will finally quiet the ache inside. But the ache remains, because the ache was never asking for more noise. It was asking for truth. And this is where intimacy becomes so important. Not because intimacy is merely romantic, not because love fixes people, but because closeness has a way of revealing what performance tries to hide. A man can avoid himself for years in work, habits, ambition, entertainment, and distraction. But when he stands before genuine intimacy, something begins to shake. Because intimacy asks more than attraction. It asks presence, honesty, emotional availability, humility, consistency. It asks a man to remain real when it would be easier to retreat into masks. That is why so many awakenings begin in relational pain. A woman may not be the cause of his awakening, but she often becomes the mirror. Not because she is perfect, not because she exists to teach him, but because closeness reveals fracture. In her presence, he may suddenly see how deeply he fears rejection, how desperately he wants control, how quickly he shuts down when he feels unseen, how much of his confidence is built on being desired rather than being grounded, how often he mistakes emotional power for emotional maturity. This realization can be unsettling, because a sleeping man does not want to be seen too clearly. He may want love, but only if love does not challenge the image he has built. He may want closeness, but only if closeness does not require transformation. He may want devotion, but without discipline, passion, but without honesty, admiration, but without accountability. And yet, life does not allow this forever. Sooner or later, every man is confronted by a moment that exposes the gap between who he appears to be and who he really is. It may happen through heartbreak. It may happen through failure. It may happen through loneliness. It may happen through losing someone who saw through his masks. It may happen in the silence after a victory that somehow feels empty. It may happen when he realizes that despite all his effort, he still does not feel at peace. That moment matters, because that moment is often the beginning of awakening. The crisis of the sleeping masculine is not that a man is broken beyond repair. It is that he has forgotten the deeper architecture of his own spirit. He has mistaken armor for identity. He has confused numbness for mastery. He has settled for being effective instead of being integrated. But the soul does not stay silent forever. Something inside every man knows when he is living beneath his calling. Something inside him knows when his lust is masking loneliness, when his ambition is masking insecurity, when his anger is masking grief, when his detachment is masking fear, when his charm is masking emptiness, when his confidence is fragile because it depends too heavily on external confirmation. And this inner knowing becomes unbearable eventually. Because no man was made merely to consume, perform, impress, and escape. He was made to build, bless, protect, discern, and lead. He was made to carry weight without becoming hardened. He was made to feel deeply without becoming unstable. He was made to hold power without worshiping it. He was made to love without needing to possess. He was made to become a vessel of order in a disordered world. That is the divine masculine. Not a fantasy, not a trend, not an aesthetic. A spiritual reality. It is the man who can enter a room without needing to dominate it. The man who can hear hard truth without collapsing into defensiveness. The man who can desire deeply without becoming enslaved by desire. The man who can remain steady under pressure because his center is not built on applause. The man who does not run from his own soul. But before he becomes that man, he must first face the crisis. He must admit that something in him is asleep. He must acknowledge that not everything he was taught about masculinity was whole. He must become honest about the patterns that keep him fragmented. He must stop romanticizing his own avoidance. He must stop calling emotional distance peace. He must stop calling inconsistency freedom. He must stop calling ego strength. He must stop calling hunger love. And perhaps hardest of all, he must let himself grieve. Grieve the years spent performing. Grieve the relationships affected by his unhealed patterns. Grieve the tenderness he buried to survive. Grieve the boy who learned that being real was unsafe. Grieve the man he could have become sooner, had he been taught that masculinity is not the absence of feeling, but the disciplined stewardship of it. This grief is not weakness. It is sacred. Because grief softens what pride hardens. Grief opens what denial keeps shut. Grief humbles the ego enough for truth to enter. And once truth enters, awakening becomes possible. That is the hope hidden inside this crisis. The sleeping masculine is not the end of the story. It is the first chapter of transformation. The man who begins to see his patterns can change them. The man who begins to tell the truth can be rebuilt by it. The man who stops running can finally be led. The man who faces the mirror can become worthy of what his soul has always longed for. Not just love from another, but union within himself. Because the first sacred relationship is not between man and woman. It is between a man and the truth. And when he can no longer betray that truth, everything begins to change. His presence changes. His standards change. His desires change. His relationships change. His language changes. His discipline changes. His purpose changes. He no longer wants to merely be admired. He wants to be aligned. He no longer wants to merely win externally. He wants to become trustworthy internally. He no longer asks, "How do I look powerful?" He begins to ask, "What kind of man am I becoming?" That question is where awakening starts. Not in perfection. Not in performance. But in honest confrontation. So if the sleeping masculine is a crisis, it is also an invitation. An invitation to wake up. An invitation to stop hiding behind old identities. An invitation to become more than efficient, desirable, or respected. An invitation to become real. Because the world does not just need successful men. It needs awake men. Men who know how to carry truth. Men who can protect without controlling. Men who can lead without ego. Men who can love without manipulation. Men who can face themselves without turning away. And perhaps the greatest tragedy is not that so many men have fallen asleep. Perhaps the greatest tragedy would be if they never realized they were meant to rise. Chapter 2. Intimacy is a mirror, not just a feeling. Most people think intimacy is something soft. A feeling. A spark. A moment of closeness. A late-night conversation that lingers in the air. A hand held a little longer than expected. A gaze that seems to say everything words cannot. And yes, intimacy can be tender. It can be beautiful. It can feel like warmth after years of inner winter. It can arrive as comfort, as relief. As a sense of being seen in a world where so much remains hidden. But intimacy is not only soft. It is also revealing. It does not merely soothe a man, it uncovers him. This is one of the most misunderstood truths in the awakening of the divine masculine. Many men enter intimacy hoping to feel desired, affirmed, wanted, understood, even rescued from their loneliness. What they do not expect is that real closeness will begin to expose everything in them that has not yet healed. Because intimacy is not just a pleasant emotion. It is a mirror. And a mirror does not flatter. A mirror tells the truth. It reflects what is there, not what a man wishes were there. It shows him how he responds when he cannot control perception. It reveals how he behaves when another person gets close enough to touch the parts of him he has kept buried. It reveals whether his confidence is grounded or fragile, whether his strength is real or rehearsed, whether his love is mature or mixed with fear, possession, avoidance, pride, and hunger. This is why intimacy can feel so destabilizing. A man may think he wants closeness, and in one sense he does. Deep down, most men long to be met, to be understood without performance, to be received without having to constantly prove themselves, to be known beneath the surface of role, status, competence, and image. But the moment that longing begins to be answered, another force often rises alongside it. Fear. Because to be truly known is also to risk exposure. To be loved deeply is also to risk rejection. To be seen clearly is also to lose the protection of illusion. So many men live with a hidden contradiction. They crave intimacy, yet resist the very conditions required for it. They want connection, but not vulnerability. They want closeness, but not accountability. They want acceptance, but not revelation. They want to be loved, but not necessarily transformed. Yet authentic intimacy refuses these half measures. It reaches past charm, past seduction, past conversation, past chemistry, past curated identity. And it asks a deeper question. Who are you when there is nowhere left to hide? That question changes everything. Because a man can survive for years through adaptation. He can become highly skilled at being appealing, composed, independent, witty, strategic, and emotionally controlled. He can know exactly how to create attraction. He can know what to say, how to act, when to pull back, when to lean in, how to maintain mystery, and how to preserve the upper hand. But intimacy does not care about the upper hand. Intimacy cares about truth. And truth begins where strategy ends. This is why many masculine awakenings begin in moments that feel confusing, humbling, or emotionally disarming. A man may encounter someone whose presence touches him more deeply than he expected, not merely because she is beautiful, but because something about her presence interrupts his usual defenses. He cannot remain entirely performative around her. He feels seen in places he did not intend to reveal. He feels called out without being attacked. He feels drawn in, yet also exposed. That experience can be deeply unsettling, because suddenly, the patterns that once protected him no longer feel powerful. They begin to feel small. His detachment no longer feels like maturity. It feels like fear. His silence no longer feels like control. It feels like avoidance. His charm no longer feels like strength. It feels like camouflage. His need to stay desired no longer feels like confidence. It feels like dependence. And that is the power of intimacy as a mirror. It reveals not only what a man feels, but why he feels the way he does. For example, a man may become intensely uncomfortable when a woman asks a simple emotional question, not because the question is unreasonable, but because it touches an inner region he has not learned to inhabit honestly. He may withdraw, become vague, change the subject, grow irritated, or suddenly feel the need for space. On the surface, it may seem like he is simply overwhelmed or not ready. But underneath, something more revealing may be happening. He may be confronting the fact that he does not know how to stay present when emotional truth is required. He may realize that he is confident in attraction, but not in sincerity. Strong in pursuit, but weak in openness. Comfortable being admired, but uncomfortable being known. This is not because he is evil. It is because intimacy has begun to expose the gap between his outer masculinity and his inner formation. And that gap is where awakening begins. The sleeping masculine often mistakes intensity for intimacy. He may feel a powerful bond, a magnetic pull, a deep fascination, even an emotional obsession. He may think, because the feelings are strong, that the connection is deep. But intensity alone does not transform a man. In fact, intensity can sometimes become a hiding place. It can keep him stimulated without ever making him honest. Real intimacy is not measured by how strongly he feels. It is measured by how truthfully he can remain. Can he stay open when he feels uncertain? Can he communicate without disappearing? Can he listen without becoming defensive? Can he tolerate being misunderstood without shutting down? Can he remain steady when closeness begins to challenge his self-image? These are not small questions. They cut to the center of masculine maturity. Because many men have learned how to desire, far fewer have learned how to endure the self-revelation that love requires. And make no mistake, intimacy reveals far more than romantic weakness. It reveals a man's theology of self, his beliefs about worth, his relationship to shame, his tolerance for discomfort, his understanding of trust, his patterns of control, his nervous system, his unspoken stories about abandonment, inadequacy, and power. A man may say he wants a deep woman, a real woman, a loyal woman, a spiritually aligned woman. But when he encounters that depth in practice, when he is no longer just admired, but invited into real emotional presence, he may feel resistance rising in ways he cannot explain. Why? Because depth requires depth. A man cannot sustainably hold what he has not built within himself. If he has not cultivated inner clarity, emotional discipline, and spiritual honesty, then genuine intimacy will not simply feel romantic. It will feel demanding, not because the other person is too much, but because truth is asking him to become more than he has been. This is why some men sabotage the very connections they prayed for. Not always consciously. Sometimes they do it through inconsistency. Sometimes through emotional unavailability. Sometimes through hot and cold behavior. Sometimes through pride. Sometimes through vanishing the moment things become too real. Sometimes through keeping one foot in and one foot out, preserving the fantasy of connection while avoiding the cost of full presence. And the tragedy is this: he may genuinely care. He may genuinely feel something rare. But feeling is not enough to sustain sacred intimacy. Character is. Inner capacity is. Self-confrontation is. The courage to remain in truth is. Without those things, intimacy becomes unbearable because it becomes diagnostic. It begins to reveal where he is still split, still reactive, still dependent on control, still fleeing from grief, still uncomfortable with tenderness, still unable to hold both strength and softness without perceiving one as a threat to the other. Consider the man who is strong in public but collapses in private conflict. He may lead teams, solve problems, handle pressure, and move through the world with admirable discipline. Yet in close relationship, he becomes evasive, defensive, or emotionally inaccessible. Why? Because the arena of achievement and the arena of intimacy require different kinds of strength. The outer world rewards performance. The inner world demands presence. The outer world may praise certainty. The inner world requires humility. The outer world allows compartmentalization. The inner world eventually exposes it. So when intimacy becomes a mirror, it often confronts a man with a painful realization. He is not as free as he thought he was. He may be ruled by patterns he once called preferences. He may be bound by fears he once called standards. He may be living inside defenses he once called personality. This is why true intimacy can feel like both attraction and crisis. It is attraction because the soul recognizes something meaningful. It is crisis because meaning always threatens illusion. A woman's presence may stir longing in him, yes, but it may also stir unresolved grief. Old rejection, fear of not being enough, fear of being consumed, fear of losing control, fear of needing too much, fear of failing someone who sees greatness in him that he himself has not yet become able to embody consistently. And here is where the masculine must decide. Will he retreat into familiar defenses? Or will he let the mirror teach him? This is the turning point. Because every man who awakens eventually realizes that intimacy was never just about finding the right person. It was about becoming the kind of man who can remain real in the presence of depth. That is a spiritual task. It means learning to sit with discomfort instead of escaping it. It means learning to name emotions without being ruled by them. It means learning to hear hard truths without collapsing into shame or aggression. It means learning to separate genuine discernment from ego protection. It means learning that vulnerability is not the collapse of masculinity, but the refinement of it. The divine masculine is not awakened by comfort alone. He is awakened by revelation. And intimacy is one of life's greatest instruments of revelation. It shows him where he is performative, where he is fragmented, where he is hungry, where he is dishonest with himself, where he longs for love but fears surrender, where he wants devotion but resists discipline, where he mistakes emotional numbness for peace. But the mirror is not there to shame him. This matters. Intimacy does not reveal in order to destroy. It reveals in order to invite transformation. The purpose of the mirror is not condemnation. It is clarity. And clarity, though painful at first, is mercy. Because what remains hidden cannot be healed. What remains unnamed cannot be transformed. What remains defended cannot become sacred. A man must see before he can change. He must know before he can rebuild. He must be stripped of illusion before he can stand in something real. This is why some of the most important relational moments are not the most pleasurable ones. They are the moments that force honesty. The moment he notices he becomes cold when he feels vulnerable. The moment he realizes he seeks admiration more than connection. The moment he sees how often he uses silence as control. The moment he recognizes that what he calls high standards is sometimes fear of being known. The moment he admits that part of him wants love, while another part only wants the safety of distance. Those moments are sacred, even when they sting. Because the divine masculine does not wake up through fantasy. He wakes up through truth. And perhaps one of the most powerful truths intimacy teaches is this. The greatest threat to a man is not being hurt by another person. The greatest threat is remaining hidden from himself. To remain hidden is to remain asleep. To remain asleep is to repeat the same cycles with different faces. To repeat the same cycles is to confuse destiny with pattern. But when a man allows intimacy to reveal him, really reveal him, something begins to shift. He stops asking only, "Why is this connection affecting me so deeply?" and begins asking, "What is this connection showing me about myself?" That question is mature. That question is sacred. That question opens the door. Because once a man begins to see intimacy as a mirror, he stops blaming every discomfort on the other person. He stops assuming that emotional challenge means incompatibility. He stops reducing closeness to pleasure and starts recognizing it as apprenticeship. He begins to understand that love, or even the possibility of love, is one of life's most refined spiritual classrooms. Not because another person completes him, but because closeness reveals what in him is still incomplete. And that realization, if embraced with courage, becomes the birthplace of awakening. So no, intimacy is not just a feeling. It is a mirror. It is a sacred unveiling. It is a confrontation with self. It is the place where illusion trembles and truth begins to breathe. It is where the sleeping masculine discovers that what he feared most was never closeness itself. It was the man he would have to become in order to sustain it. And yet that is the invitation. Not to run from the mirror. Not to resent it. Not to crack it when it tells the truth. But to stand before it long enough for the false to fall away. Because on the other side of that honesty is not humiliation. It is freedom. And the man who can endure that mirror without turning away is already beginning to wake up. Chapter 3. He cannot awaken while he is still performing. One of the greatest obstacles to the awakening of the divine masculine is not weakness. It is performance. Not the kind that happens on a stage, under bright lights, with an audience watching from a distance. A deeper kind, a quieter kind, a more dangerous kind. The performance of strength. The performance of detachment. The performance of certainty. the performance of confidence, the performance of being unaffected, the performance of being in control. Many men do not realize how much of their identity has been built this way. They believe they are simply being strong, simply being masculine, simply being composed, simply being careful with their emotions, simply keeping their standards high. But beneath those explanations, there is often a more painful truth. They are acting. Not because they are fake in a shallow sense, not because every part of them is dishonest, but because somewhere along the way, they learned that being fully real did not feel safe. So they began to curate themselves. They built a version of manhood that could survive admiration, avoid humiliation, command attention, and reduce the risk of rejection. The problem is this: what helps a man survive is not always what helps him awaken. An awakening demands far more than survival. A man cannot step into sacred masculinity while living from a mask. He cannot become aligned with truth while being loyal to an image. He cannot experience genuine inner power while depending on performance to feel valuable. Because the divine masculine is not an act. It is an integration. It is what remains when a man no longer needs to look powerful in order to feel whole. Performance always asks, how am I being perceived? Awakening asks, what is true? Performance asks, how do I stay admired? Awakening asks, what must I surrender to become real? Performance protects the ego. Awakening purifies it. This is why so many men remain asleep for years while appearing highly functional. Their lives may look impressive from the outside. They may be respected, desired, disciplined, articulate, productive, and socially magnetic. They may know exactly how to carry themselves, exactly how to speak, exactly how to attract, exactly how to avoid looking needy, uncertain, emotional, or exposed. But in private, the structure is more fragile than it appears. Because performance is exhausting. It requires constant maintenance, constant self-monitoring, constant image management, constant resistance to vulnerability, constant protection against being seen too clearly. The man who performs strength cannot rest, because rest threatens the image. The man who performs indifference cannot soften, because softness threatens control. The man who performs confidence cannot admit confusion, because confusion threatens admiration. So he keeps going. He becomes more polished, more strategic, more difficult to read, more careful with what he reveals, more attached to the version of himself that seems least breakable. And slowly, almost without noticing, he begins to disappear inside his own construction. This is one of the saddest dimensions of masculine performance. At first, the mask is something he wears. Eventually, it becomes something he identifies with. He no longer says, I am protecting myself. He begins to say, this is just who I am. I'm just not emotional. I'm just private. I'm just focused. I'm just built differently. I'm just not the type to open up. I'm just better on my own. I'm just keeping things simple. Sometimes these statements contain a grain of truth, but often they are half-truths that conceal a deeper wound. They allow a man to remain unchallenged by his own patterns. They give his defenses the dignity of personality. They let him confuse adaptation with essence. And this is where performance becomes spiritual stagnation. Because a man who identifies too strongly with his armor will resist anything that invites him beyond it. He will avoid conversations that require emotional honesty. He will resist relationships that expose his inconsistency. He will feel irritated by those who ask him to be more present, more transparent, more accountable, more sincere. Not always because those people are demanding too much, but because their presence threatens the role he has been playing. A role can be maintained. Truth must be embodied. That is a different kind of labor entirely. To embody truth, a man must stop asking only how to appear strong and begin asking whether his strength is rooted in reality. He must ask whether his calm is peace or suppression, whether his independence is maturity or fear of relying on anyone, whether his standards are discernment or avoidance, whether his mystery is depth or emotional unavailability dressed in better language. These questions are uncomfortable. But discomfort is often the doorway through which performance begins to crack. And usually something has to crack it. Sometimes it is heartbreak. Sometimes it is failure. Sometimes it is a woman who sees through him more quickly than he expected. Sometimes it is the strange emptiness that follows achievement. Sometimes it is the unbearable fatigue of always having to hold the image together. Sometimes it is the realization that although many people admire him, very few actually know him. That realization can feel devastating. Because performance often brings rewards. It can bring status, attraction, validation, influence, control. The performed masculine can do very well in the world for a while. It can gain access to many things, but it cannot produce peace. Why? Because peace does not come from being well managed. It comes from being undivided. And a performing man is divided by nature. He is divided between what he feels and what he shows. Between what he fears and what he admits. Between what he wants and what he permits himself to need. Between the boy who learned to hide and the man who longs to be whole. This division creates tension everywhere. He may feel lonely even when surrounded by attention. He may feel unseen even when praised. He may feel restless even when successful. He may feel emotionally hungry even when physically close to someone. Because performance can attract contact, but it cannot sustain intimacy. Intimacy demands presence, and presence is impossible when so much energy is being spent on self-protection. This is why a man who is still performing often struggles most when the relationship becomes real. In the early stages, performance can look attractive. Confidence appears effortless. Mystery appears depthful. Emotional restraint appears disciplined. The carefully constructed self can feel magnetic. But over time, the mask begins to cost more than it gives. He becomes harder to reach. More inconsistent. Less capable of direct honesty. More reactive when challenged. More defensive when confronted. More tempted to withdraw instead of reveal. And underneath all of that is often one simple terror. If you see the real me, will I still be enough? This is the hidden fear beneath so much masculine performance. Not merely the fear of rejection, but the fear that what lies beneath the polished exterior is not worthy of devotion. That if the charm falls away, if the certainty softens, if the control slips, if the carefully managed identity cracks open, then what remains may be too human, too needy, too wounded, too unfinished. So he performs harder. He sharpens the image. He perfects the posture. He hides the tenderness. He buries the uncertainty. He doubles down on detachment. He mistakes distance for dignity. But the soul cannot awaken under that pressure forever. Something inside a man eventually begins to tire of being edited. Something inside him wants to breathe. Not as a role. Not as a persona. Not as a symbol of masculinity. But as a human being under God, under truth, under responsibility, under the sacred weight of becoming real. This longing is holy. It is the beginning of the end of performance. Because the first sign of awakening is not that a man suddenly becomes perfect. It is that he becomes less willing to lie, especially to himself. He begins to notice how often he curates his reactions. How often he suppresses authentic emotion to maintain control. How often he performs certainty when he actually feels lost. How often he plays the strong one because he does not know how to ask for help without feeling diminished. And this noticing matters. Awakening starts with recognition. A man must first see the mask before he can remove it. He must recognize the difference between composure and concealment, between leadership and image maintenance, between real self-respect and ego preservation, between sacred masculine presence and the performance of invulnerability. This is not always easy to do, because the world often rewards the mask. The mask is efficient. The mask is socially legible. The mask is easier to admire than a man in honest transformation. People understand polish more quickly than they understand depth. But heaven does not measure a man by polish. Truth does not bow to optics. And the divine masculine is not concerned first with whether a man looks whole. It is concerned with whether he is becoming whole. That process is rarely glamorous. It may require a man to admit he has been afraid. Afraid of being seen. Afraid of being needy. Afraid of being ordinary. Afraid of not measuring up. Afraid of emotional dependence. Afraid of genuine tenderness. Afraid of what love will demand if it becomes real. It may require him to admit that much of what he called discipline was actually emotional tightness. That much of what he called standards was actually fear. That much of what he called peace was actually numbness. That much of what he called self-control was actually the inability to trust anyone with his inner life. These are not small admissions. They strike at the root of identity. But that is precisely why they are necessary. A sacred masculinity cannot be built on falsehood, even elegant falsehood. It cannot be anchored in an image, no matter how compelling that image looks to others. It must be formed in the furnace of honesty. And honesty is deeply humbling. It strips a man of the right to hide behind his own mythology. It says, "You are not only the one who leads. You are also the one who avoids. You are not only the one who provides. You are also the one who withholds. You are not only the one who appears calm. You are also the one who fears collapse. You are not only the one others depend on. You are also the one who has not yet learned how to depend rightly on truth." This kind of self-confrontation can feel brutal at first. But it is mercy. Because what performance conceals, truth can heal. The man who admits he has been performing is not becoming weaker. He is becoming reachable. Reachable by truth. Reachable by intimacy. Reachable by grace. Reachable by the deeper formation that the divine masculine requires. And what does that formation look like? It looks like a man who no longer needs to dominate the room to feel secure. A man who can say, "I was wrong," without feeling destroyed. A man who can communicate plainly instead of hiding behind silence. A man who can feel deeply without losing his center. A man who can stay when discomfort rises. A man who does not seduce others into closeness only to retreat when real openness is required. A man who no longer confuses emotional opacity with masculine depth. This is not softness without backbone. It is strength without disguise. That is very different. The performing man wants to be seen a certain way. The awakened man wants to be aligned, even if alignment costs him the old image. And yes, that cost is real. To stop performing often means losing forms of approval that were built on the mask. It may mean disappointing people who only knew the polished version. It may mean entering a season where a man feels less impressive, less certain, less in control. But what he gains is far more precious. He gains integrity. He gains inner coherence. He gains the ability to stand before himself without needing theatrics. He gains the freedom of not having to constantly defend a persona. He gains the possibility of being loved for what is true, not merely admired for what is curated. This is why performance must die. Not because discipline is bad. Not because confidence is bad. Not because masculine strength is bad. But because anything that replaces truth will eventually corrupt strength from within. A man can only awaken when he becomes willing to be real at the point where he once preferred to be impressive. That sentence alone could change a life. Real at the point where he once preferred to be admired. Real at the point where he once preferred to be mysterious. Real at the point where he once preferred to be untouchable. Real at the point where he once preferred to look strong rather than become sincere. This is the death of performance. And every true masculine awakening includes it. Because the divine masculine is not born in image management. It is born in surrender. The surrender of false control. The surrender of self-protective vanity. The surrender of the exhausting need to maintain an identity that no longer fits the soul. And once that surrender begins, a new kind of man starts to emerge. Not a perfect man. Not a man who has no wounds. Not a man who never feels fear. But a man who is no longer loyal to the mask. A man who chooses truth over appearance. Presence over strategy. Integrity over impression. Depth over performance. That man can awaken. Because awakening does not ask a man to look powerful. It asks him to stop hiding from the power that only truth can build. And until he is willing to do that, he may remain admired, wanted, respected, even envied. But he will not yet be free. He will still be acting. And the soul of a man was never created merely to act. It was created to become. Chapter 4. Desire without depth leaves him empty. There is a kind of hunger that feels powerful in the moment and hollow afterward. Many men know this feeling, even if they do not have language for it. It begins as longing, as attraction, as pursuit, as the rush of being wanted, as the thrill of being noticed, as the intoxicating sensation of chemistry, tension, fantasy, possibility. In those moments, desire can feel like proof of life itself. It makes the blood move faster. It sharpens the senses. It creates urgency. It gives a man the feeling that something important is happening, something vivid, something real. And yet, for many men, the same thing that makes them feel intensely alive for a moment leaves them strangely empty once the moment passes. Why? Because desire by itself is not the same as depth. And when a man confuses the two, he can spend years chasing stimulation while starving at the level of the soul. This is one of the central crises in the masculine awakening. Not that desire exists, but that desire is often mistaken for fulfillment. A man feels strongly, so he assumes something meaningful must be happening. He wants intensely, so he assumes he must be alive in a profound way. He experiences passion, so he believes he has touched something sacred. But intensity is not always sacred. Sometimes it is simply unexamined hunger. Sometimes it is loneliness wearing perfume. Sometimes it is insecurity wrapped in confidence. Sometimes it is emotional emptiness, searching for temporary relief. Sometimes it is the ego trying to convince itself that being desired is the same as being valuable. And that is why desire alone cannot wake the divine masculine. Because the divine masculine is not awakened by appetite. He is awakened by meaning. A man can have endless experiences that excite him, attract him, even consume his thoughts, and still remain fundamentally asleep. He can feel pleasure without peace. He can feel chemistry without clarity. He can feel chosen without feeling transformed. He can be surrounded by opportunities for contact, and yet remain untouched where it matters most. This is what makes the chase so deceptive. The chase gives a man motion. It gives him adrenaline. It gives him something to focus on. It gives him a temporary sense of purpose. But motion is not the same as direction. A man may be running hard while moving in circles. He may tell himself he is exploring, enjoying life, following instinct, embracing freedom, keeping things uncomplicated. But underneath those explanations there may be a quieter truth. He may be using desire to avoid stillness, avoid grief, avoid self-confrontation, avoid the frightening silence in which he would have to face what his soul is actually hungry for. Because stillness asks dangerous questions. Why does he need constant novelty to feel alive? Why does admiration calm him so quickly? Why does attention act like medicine? Why does conquest lose its flavor so fast? Why does he feel restless immediately after getting what he thought he wanted? These are not small questions. They lead a man into territory far deeper than pleasure. They force him to examine whether his desires are serving his becoming or sabotaging it. Many men never ask this. They simply keep pursuing. One more connection. One more thrill. One more flirtation. One more fantasy. One more experience that promises to deliver the substance that previous experiences somehow failed to provide. And this cycle can continue for years. Outwardly, it may look like confidence. Inwardly, it is often compensation. Because when a man has not yet rooted himself in purpose, truth, and inner stability, desire becomes easy to misuse. It becomes a substitute for identity, a shortcut to feeling powerful, a fast path to validation, a convenient escape from the ache of deeper formation. For a while it works. That is the problem. It works just enough to keep him from noticing the cost. It works enough to distract him from his emptiness. Enough to delay self-examination. Enough to make him believe he is fulfilled when he is actually only occupied. Enough to keep him chasing instead of building. But eventually, the cost reveals itself. He begins to notice that pleasure fades quickly, that admiration is never enough, that chemistry cannot hold him together, that being wanted does not cure his fragmentation, that excitement collapses into restlessness, that the more he consumes without depth, the less alive he actually feels. This is the emptiness that follows desire without depth. Not because desire is evil, not because attraction is wrong, not because passion is the enemy, but because desire was never meant to be the master. It was meant to be integrated into something higher. A sacred masculine life does not reject desire. It orders it. It disciplines it. It places it in service of truth, rather than allowing it to become the ruler of identity. The awakened man does not become less capable of desire. He becomes less enslaved by it. That is a profound difference. An unawakened man asks, "What do I want right now?" An awakened man asks, "What is this desire leading me toward?" One question is impulsive. The other is discerning. One asks for relief. The other asks for alignment. One is ruled by appetite. The other is guided by purpose. And purpose is what transforms desire from a source of emptiness into a source of energy rightly directed. Because at its deepest level, desire is not only sexual or romantic. It is spiritual. It is the life force of movement toward something. The issue is not that a man desires. The issue is whether he understands what he is truly desiring beneath the surface. He may think he desires a woman, but perhaps he desires affirmation. He may think he desires intimacy, but perhaps he desires escape from loneliness. He may think he desires passion, but perhaps he desires a break from numbness. He may think he desires conquest, but perhaps he is trying to outrun feelings of inadequacy. He may think he desires freedom, but perhaps he is simply afraid of the demands that real love would place upon him. Until he learns to read himself honestly, he will continue to misname his hunger. And a hunger that is misnamed cannot be satisfied. This is why so many men feel an ache they cannot explain. They keep reaching outward for something that can only be answered inwardly. They want someone else to make them feel whole when they have not yet become hospitable to wholeness within themselves. They want intensity to replace emptiness. They want desire to silence the soul's deeper questions. But the soul keeps speaking. Even in the middle of pleasure, it speaks. Even after the excitement fades, it speaks. Even in the silence of an unshared bed, a dim room, a late night, a successful life that still feels curiously thin, it speaks. It says, "This is not enough. This is not what you were made for. You are feeding appetite and starving essence. You are consuming sparks while neglecting the fire that could actually sustain you." This voice is uncomfortable, but sacred, because it marks the beginning of discernment. And discernment is what separates the sleeping masculine from the awakening one. The sleeping masculine follows impulse and calls it freedom. The awakening masculine begins to question whether every impulse deserves obedience. That question alone can change a man's life. Because not everything that excites him is good for him. Not everything that pulls him is worthy of him. Not everything that he wants in the moment will strengthen the man he is becoming. This is where restraint enters the story. And restraint is often misunderstood. Many people think restraint is repression, weakness, denial, lack of passion. But sacred restraint is none of these things. Sacred restraint is the ability to hold power without wasting it. It is the refusal to spend oneself cheaply. It is the wisdom to know that not every hunger should be fed immediately, and that some desires must be examined before they are acted upon. A man without restraint becomes porous. He leaks energy. He leaks focus. He leaks integrity. He leaks sacred force into anything that temporarily flatters him. A man with restraint becomes concentrated. He gathers himself. He becomes intentional. He stops scattering his power across fleeting experiences and begins building something durable. This is one of the great turning points in masculine awakening. The realization that desire is not proof of destiny. Just because he wants something deeply does not mean he is meant to pursue it blindly. Just because he feels drawn does not mean he is aligned. Just because something feels good does not mean it will bear good fruit. These realizations can feel sobering, especially for a man who has spent years trusting appetite more than wisdom. He may begin to see how much time he lost chasing what never had the power to nourish him. How many connections were built on intensity but lacked foundation. How many choices were driven by ego rather than clarity. How many moments of passion concealed a deeper poverty of spirit. This grief is important, because without grieving the emptiness of what once ruled him, he may continue to romanticize it. He may continue telling himself that the old life was freedom, when in truth it was often compulsion with better branding. The divine masculine cannot awaken in a man who still worships stimulation. He must outgrow the fantasy that more desire will eventually become depth if he just keeps indulging it. It will not. Depth requires a different path. It requires patience, reflection, self-honesty, consistency, inner order, moral courage, a willingness to sit with longing without immediately trying to discharge it. This is very difficult in a world built to keep men overstimulated. Everywhere he turns, he is taught to chase more. More beauty, more novelty, more access, more excitement, more gratification, more proof that he is wanted, virile, powerful, winning. Very little in modern culture tells a man that his real power may begin when he stops obeying every appetite and starts listening for what his soul is actually asking for. What if the emptiness is not a sign that he needs more experiences? What if it is a sign that he needs more truth? What if the ache after pleasure is not punishment? What if it is revelation? What if his dissatisfaction is holy? What if it is the soul refusing to be fed crumbs when it was made for substance? These are the kinds of questions that wake a man up. Because the awakened masculine begins to see that depth does not come from how much he can feel, but from how deeply he can live in alignment with what is real. He stops asking only whether something excites him. He asks whether it strengthens him, whether it enlarges his character, whether it deepens his integrity, whether it calls forth the best in him or merely flatters the most impulsive parts of him. This shift changes everything. It changes how he loves, how he chooses, how he waits, how he looks at women, how he interprets attraction, how he spends his energy, how he handles loneliness, how he approaches passion, how he understands power. He no longer sees desire as a king to be served. He sees it as a fire to be governed. And governed fire is useful. It warms. It illuminates. It creates. It sustains. Ungoverned fire consumes. The same is true within a man. When desire is ungoverned, it burns through peace, clarity, relationships, self-respect, and purpose. It makes him reactive. It keeps him fragmented. It gives him moments of intensity, but robs him of continuity. He becomes a man of cravings instead of convictions. But when desire is placed under truth, it becomes fuel for devotion, for discipline, for creation, for focused love, for sacred partnership, for the building of a life that can actually hold passion without being destroyed by it. This is where the divine masculine begins to rise. Not when he becomes cold. Not when he becomes passionless. Not when he kills his longing. But when longing is purified. When he no longer uses desire to escape himself. When he no longer needs conquest to feel alive. When he no longer measures worth by how much attention he can command. When he no longer confuses access with intimacy. When he no longer trades depth for stimulation. Then he begins to feel a different kind of fullness. A quieter fullness. A more stable fullness. Not the rush of being consumed by appetite, but the strength of being anchored in self-command. Not the temporary high of being wanted, but the steady dignity of being aligned. Not the chaos of chasing every spark, but the deep fire of a man whose energy serves purpose. That kind of fullness does not vanish in the morning. It does not depend on applause. It does not collapse when desire is not immediately satisfied. It endures. And perhaps that is how a man knows he is awakening. He begins to value what lasts more than what merely dazzles. He becomes less impressed by intensity and more devoted to substance. He stops treating his hunger like an unquestionable authority and starts letting truth interrogate it. Because in the end, desire without depth does leave him empty. Not because he wanted too much, but because he wanted too shallowly. He reached for sparks when he needed flame. He pursued sensation when he needed meaning. He fed appetite when his soul was asking for order, for purpose, for integrity, for sacred direction. And when he finally sees that, not just intellectually, but in the marrow of his life, everything begins to change. He does not stop desiring. He starts desiring more truthfully. He starts wanting what can actually nourish him, what can deepen him, what can refine him, what can make him more than merely satisfied for a moment. He begins to long for what is worthy of his strength. And that is when desire stops being a cycle of emptiness and becomes a doorway into transformation. Because the divine masculine does not awaken through indulgence. He awakens when he realizes that the deepest hunger in him was never for pleasure alone. It was for purpose, depth, and the kind of love that does not merely excite the body, but reorders the soul. Chapter 5. The woman he cannot manipulate becomes his greatest teacher. There is a certain kind of woman who changes a man without ever trying to control him. She does not preach. She does not chase. She does not beg for clarity he refuses to give. She does not collapse just because he becomes inconsistent. She does not confuse his potential with his character. She does not reward confusion simply because it arrives wrapped in charm. And because of that, she becomes one of the most confronting experiences of his life. Not always because she is louder. Not because she is harder. Not because she is cold. But because she is not easily moved by the old strategies. She does not bend to performance. She does not melt at half-truths. She does not mistake emotional distance for mystery. She does not call avoidance depth. She does not worship his image while ignoring his patterns. And that is precisely why she becomes such a powerful mirror for the sleeping masculine. A man can remain asleep for a long time when the world keeps rewarding his unfinished self. He can continue in half-effort, half-honesty, half-presence as long as people keep accommodating the gap between who he appears to be and who he really is. If admiration comes easily, if attention remains available, if inconsistency still earns access, then there is very little pressure for transformation. But eventually, some men encounter a different kind of feminine presence. A woman whose self-respect is intact. A woman whose heart is open, but whose boundaries are awake. A woman who can feel deeply without abandoning discernment. A woman who may care, but will not participate in her own diminishment. And when he meets her, something in him stirs. At first, he may call it fascination, chemistry, magnetism, a rare connection. And perhaps it is. But underneath the attraction is something even more important. Exposure. Because a woman he cannot manipulate does not merely interrupt his habits. She reveals them. She reveals how often he uses charm to delay accountability. How often he uses ambiguity to preserve control. How often he withdraws when emotional truth is required. How often he relies on being desired to avoid becoming disciplined. How often he mistakes being wanted for being worthy. This is why such a woman can feel both irresistible and threatening to the unawakened masculine. Irresistible, because part of him recognizes depth. Threatening, because depth is expensive. A shallow dynamic costs very little. A real woman costs the mask. And many men do not understand this at first. They think their discomfort is about her standards, her intensity, her emotional presence, her refusal to play along with vagueness. But often the real discomfort is this. She is not letting him stay divided without consequence. She is not punishing him. She is not trying to dominate him. She is simply refusing to call fragmentation by holy names. She will not call inconsistency freedom. She will not call emotional withholding strength. She will not call mixed signals complexity. She will not call ego leadership. She will not call unhealed wounds just the way he is. And in that refusal, she becomes one of the greatest teachers a man can meet. Not because women exist to fix men. They do not. Not because feminine pain is meant to educate masculine immaturity. It is not. But because truth teaches, even when it arrives through relationship. And the woman he cannot manipulate often becomes the carrier of that truth. She teaches him that attraction is not the same as access. That feeling deeply is not the same as showing up maturely. That having potential is not the same as embodying character. That saying the right things is not the same as becoming trustworthy. That intensity can never replace integrity. This is difficult medicine, especially for a man who has spent years receiving affirmation without refinement. He may be used to dynamics where his inconsistency is tolerated because his charisma is strong, where his silence is romanticized, where his confusion is overinterpreted, where others do emotional labor on his behalf, hoping his deeper self will eventually emerge if they just remain patient enough. Then he meets the woman who does something different. She sees him, perhaps more clearly than most. She may even recognize his pain, his depth, his potential, his buried sincerity. But she does not worship the buried version of him while excusing the version he is actively choosing. That distinction matters. Because many men are loved for who they could be. Very few are confronted with who they are. And the confrontation is holy. Not comfortable. Not flattering. But holy. A woman like this does not necessarily say many dramatic things. Sometimes her greatest lesson is in what she no longer accepts, in what she does not chase, in how she remains anchored when he expected her to become confused, in how she walks away from breadcrumbs without bitterness, in how she refuses to turn self-betrayal into devotion. That kind of feminine steadiness can shake a man more deeply than any argument. Why? Because manipulation depends on access to weakness. It depends on someone else doubting themselves, overfunctioning, waiting endlessly, explaining away poor behavior, accepting emotional crumbs because they are attached to moments of intensity. When he cannot find that access, his usual tools begin to fail. Charm does not work the same. Distance does not work the same. Hot and cold patterns do not work the same. Vagueness does not work the same. And when the old strategies fail, one of two things usually happens. He either hardens further into ego, or he begins to wake up. This is the crossroads. The ego says, she is too much. The awakening soul says, why do I feel so exposed? The ego says, she should have been more patient. The awakening soul says, why did I expect patience without accountability? The ego says, she did not understand me. The awakening soul says, did I ever truly make myself understandable? The ego says, I lost something rare. The awakening soul says, why was I not ready to protect what I knew was rare? These are painful questions. But painful questions are often the birthplace of masculine maturity. Because the woman he cannot manipulate forces him to confront a truth he may have avoided for years. He cannot build sacred love on ego tactics. He cannot sustain depth through control. He cannot keep reaching for intimacy while refusing the discipline intimacy requires. In this sense, she becomes a teacher not by instruction, but by embodiment. She embodies self-respect. Embodied truth always teaches those still living in performance. She embodies clarity. Clarity always unsettles those who depend on ambiguity. She embodies emotional congruence. Congruence always exposes those who are split between words and action. She embodies devotion without self-abandonment. And that is deeply confronting to a man who has confused being loved with being endlessly accommodated. But there is an even deeper layer here. Often, what a man tries to manipulate in relationship is not just the woman. It is reality. He wants the reality of closeness without the reality of responsibility. The reality of being desired without the reality of consistency. The reality of emotional refuge without the reality of emotional honesty. The reality of sacred feminine energy without the reality of becoming a man strong enough to honor it. That is why manipulation is ultimately a spiritual issue. It is the attempt to gain what one has not yet become ready to hold rightly. and the woman who cannot be manipulated interrupts that illusion. She stands as a living reminder that some things cannot be possessed through charm. They can only be received through character. That lesson can humble a man profoundly. He may begin to see how often he reached for influence instead of integrity. How often he preserved optionality instead of offering truth. How often he enjoyed the light of a woman's presence without wanting to become accountable to the responsibility that light created. This is where regret often enters. Not just regret over losing her, but regret over the man he was while he had the chance to rise. That kind of regret can become destructive if it turns into self-pity. But it can become transformative if it turns into repentance. And repentance, in its deepest sense, is not shame. It is realignment. It is the moment a man stops defending his lower patterns and begins taking responsibility for them. It is the moment he says, perhaps for the first time with full sincerity, "My pain may explain me, but it does not excuse me." It is the moment he stops blaming timing, complexity, past wounds, or feminine expectations for what was ultimately his own lack of integration. That moment is sacred. Because once a man accepts that he cannot manipulate his way into real love, he becomes available for a deeper kind of power. The power of honesty. The power of steadiness. The power of earned trust. The power of showing up clearly. The power of becoming the kind of man whose presence does not create confusion. This is what the divine masculine begins to learn. That love is not proven by how intensely he feels in private. It is proven by how truthfully he behaves in reality. That being deeply affected by a woman does not automatically make him mature. That recognizing her worth is not enough if he does not develop the character to meet it. That longing for sacred union means very little if he still clings to tactics that protect ego at the expense of connection. And so, the woman he cannot manipulate becomes unforgettable. Not always because she stays. Sometimes because she does not. Sometimes her absence becomes the sermon. Sometimes the closed door becomes the revelation. Sometimes the loss becomes the teacher. Not because love is cruel, but because reality is merciful enough to stop rewarding what is unready. This is one of the hardest truths a man may ever face. He can feel something genuine and still mishandle it. He can recognize something sacred and still fail to honor it. He can be drawn to truth and still resist the transformation truth demands. But if he is willing to let the lesson go deeper than heartbreak, then what first feels like loss can become initiation. He begins to understand that sacred feminine energy is not here to entertain his ego. It is here to call forth his integrity. He begins to understand that not every woman who leaves is rejecting him. Some are refusing to participate in the parts of him that still need to die. He begins to understand that the right woman will not always soothe his unfinished patterns. Sometimes she will expose them by simply refusing to bend. And if he is wise, he will not resent her for that. He will thank life for the lesson. Because the woman he cannot manipulate gives him a rare gift. She forces a decision. Will he continue becoming more skilled at influence? Or will he become more devoted to truth? Will he keep seeking women he can manage? Or will he become the kind of man who no longer needs to manage anyone because he has learned to master himself? That is the true turning point. The sleeping masculine wants access. The awakening masculine seeks alignment. The sleeping masculine asks, "How do I keep her near?" The awakening masculine asks, "What in me must change so that my love becomes worthy, clean, and trustworthy?" That second question changes everything. Because once a man begins to ask it honestly, manipulation starts to lose its seduction. Control starts to feel cheap. Charm without congruence starts to feel hollow. Distance starts to feel lonely instead of powerful. And slowly, another kind of strength begins to emerge. Not the strength to win the dynamic. The strength to stand in truth. Not the strength to control perception. The strength to become clear enough that control is no longer needed. Not the strength of performance. The strength of character. This is why the woman he cannot manipulate becomes his greatest teacher. Not because she saves him, but because she refuses to join him in the lie. And sometimes that refusal is the first mercy strong enough to wake him up. Chapter 6. Emotional avoidance is not strength. One of the most damaging lies many men inherit is this: if you can stay silent, you are strong. If you can hide what you feel, you are disciplined. If you can detach quickly, you are powerful. If you can move on without looking back, you are mature. For a while, these ideas can sound convincing. They even appear useful in a world that often rewards control more visibly than honesty. A man who does not react easily may seem composed. A man who reveals little may seem mysterious. A man who shuts down pain and keeps moving may seem resilient. But appearance is not the same as truth. And the truth is this: emotional avoidance is not strength. It is often fear with better branding. It is the attempt to preserve order by refusing to enter the places where real inner work must happen. It is the habit of staying on the surface because depth feels dangerous. It is the belief that if a man can outlast his feelings, suppress his grief, or outrun his tenderness, then he has somehow mastered himself. But a man is not mastering himself when he cannot face himself. He is merely managing distance from what scares him. That distinction matters more than most realize. Because the sleeping masculine often builds its identity around forms of emotional avoidance that look socially acceptable. He may not cry. He may not ask for reassurance. He may not show longing. He may not admit confusion. He may keep his pain private, his wounds unnamed, his fears unspoken. He may tell himself that this is dignity, discipline, independence, or masculine steadiness. And sometimes part of it is. But often, underneath the polished exterior, another reality is unfolding. He is not at peace. He is simply unpracticed in emotional truth. He is not deeply grounded. He is deeply defended. He is not always calm. He is often numb. There is a profound difference between peace and numbness. Peace has presence in it. Numbness has absence. Peace can sit with pain without being ruled by it. Numbness tries not to feel pain at all. Peace is strong because it has processed what it carries. Numbness is brittle because it has only buried it. This is why emotional avoidance eventually creates fractures in a man's life, even if those fractures are not obvious at first. The feelings he refuses to meet do not vanish. They go underground. They reorganize themselves. They emerge in other forms. Grief becomes irritability. Fear becomes control. Shame becomes arrogance. Longing becomes lust. Sadness becomes withdrawal. Insecurity becomes overachievement. Tenderness becomes sarcasm. Confusion becomes silence. The man may not recognize these transformations because he has become accustomed to reading only the outermost layer of himself. He says, "I'm just tired," or "I need space," or "I don't do drama," or "I'm focused on my life right now." Sometimes these statements are partly true, but often they conceal a deeper reality. He does not know how to stay present to his own emotional landscape without feeling threatened by it. And that is not strength. Strength is not the absence of feeling. It is the capacity to remain honest while feeling. The divine masculine is not emotionally chaotic, but neither is it emotionally absent. It does not collapse into every wave, but it does not pretend the waves are not there. It can name grief without becoming consumed by it. It can acknowledge fear without surrendering leadership. It can feel love without panicking. It can experience vulnerability without interpreting it as emasculation. This is sacred power. Not emotional perfection, but emotional responsibility. That responsibility is where many men struggle. Why? Because for countless men, emotion was never framed as something to steward. It was framed as something to conquer, conceal, or suppress. As boys, they were often taught to respect control more than honesty, to keep moving, to toughen up, to stop being dramatic, to act like a man, to carry pain quietly, to turn vulnerability into performance or bury it altogether. So they learned. They learned that if they spoke too openly, they might be mocked. If they cried, they might be shamed. If they needed comfort, they might be called weak. If they expressed fear, they might lose status. And from those early lessons, a quiet theology forms inside them. To be lovable, I must be composed. To be respected, I must be hard to shake. To be masculine, I must not need too much. To survive, I must not reveal the full truth of my inner world. This theology shapes adult relationships in powerful ways. A man may sincerely want closeness, but once intimacy touches a vulnerable area inside him, old programming activates. He grows distant. He changes the subject. He minimizes. He intellectualizes. He disappears into work. He becomes harder to reach. He says he needs time to think, when what he often means is that he does not know how to remain emotionally present without feeling exposed. Again, this does not make him evil. It makes him unfinished. But unfinished masculinity, when left unexamined, can wound deeply. Because emotional avoidance does not only affect the man avoiding. It affects everyone trying to love him. It creates confusion, mixed signals, emotional whiplash, moments of closeness followed by unexplained withdrawal, words that suggest depth, followed by behavior that avoids the responsibility of depth, promises of care, with very little capacity to remain available when care becomes costly. And often, the man himself is confused too. He may genuinely care, genuinely feel, genuinely long for connection. But because he has built his identity around avoiding certain emotions, he cannot sustain intimacy at the level he desires. The very closeness he yearns for begins to press on the very wounds he has never learned to face. So he pulls away and calls it clarity. He shuts down and calls it peace. He disconnects and calls it self-protection. He numbs out and calls it moving on. But language cannot sanctify avoidance. Sooner or later, life reveals the truth. It may reveal it through repeated relationship patterns. The same withdrawal, the same silence, the same inability to stay. It may reveal it through unexplained inner emptiness. The sense that no amount of achievement solves the ache. It may reveal it through anger that seems disproportionate. Through loneliness that deepens after every temporary relief. Through the haunting suspicion that he is watching his life rather than inhabiting it. These moments are painful, but they are sacred. Because they force the question. What if what he has called strength is actually emotional exile? That question can unravel an entire identity. Especially for the man who has spent years being praised for composure. He may be admired by others precisely for the traits that are quietly starving him. He may be known as calm, collected, private, rational, unbothered. Yet inside, he may feel disconnected from his own tenderness, unable to access his grief, unsure how to trust emotional honesty without fearing it will consume him. This is why awakening can feel humiliating at first. Not because a man becomes less masculine when he starts telling the truth, but because he begins to see how much of his masculinity was built on disowning parts of himself. That realization is sobering. He may begin to see that he was not detached because he was free. He was detached because closeness scared him. He may begin to see that he was not silent because he was wise. He was silent because he lacked language for what was happening inside him. He may begin to see that he was not calm because he had mastered emotion. He was calm because he had numbed the channels through which emotion would have asked for his attention. This recognition is not the end of masculinity. It is the beginning of mature masculinity. Because mature masculinity does not need the lie of emotional invulnerability. It can admit, this affected me. It can admit, I am angry and I need to understand why. It can admit, I felt rejected. It can admit, I do not know how to hold this yet. It can admit, part of me wants to run and I need to look honestly at that. These are not weak sentences. They are disciplined sentences. It takes far more strength to remain present with truth than to disappear behind distance. Anyone can avoid. Anyone can deflect. Anyone can retreat into silence. Anyone can call numbness peace and convince themselves they are in control. But not every man can stay. Stay with discomfort. Stay with grief. Stay with the wound long enough to understand it. Stay in the conversation instead of escaping into vagueness. Stay in his own body when emotion rises. Stay honest when the ego wants to hide. This staying is one of the deepest expressions of masculine strength. Because what is a protector if he cannot remain present under emotional pressure? What is a leader if he abandons himself the moment something vulnerable emerges? What is integrity if it exists only in situations that do not challenge the heart? The divine masculine does not rise in a man because he learns how to feel more dramatically. It rises because he learns how to feel truthfully and remain responsible within that truth. That means he must stop treating emotion like an enemy. Emotion is not the enemy. Immaturity is. A man ruled by emotion is unstable. But a man cut off from emotion is unreachable. Neither is whole. Wholeness is not found at either extreme. It is found in integration. Integration means that emotion informs him without owning him. That grief softens him without breaking his structure. That love deepens him without making him lose himself. That fear warns him without becoming his master. That tenderness remains available without making him passive. That anger is examined, not worshipped. This kind of integration requires work. It requires him to slow down enough to notice what he usually overrides. It requires him to build vocabulary where there was once only reaction. It requires him to sit with discomfort instead of trying to discharge it immediately through distraction, lust, work, control, or withdrawal. It requires him to stop asking only, "How do I get rid of this feeling?" and begin asking, "What is this feeling trying to show me?" That question changes everything. Because feelings are not always instructions, but they are often revelations. They reveal where he is insecure, where he feels unseen, where he still carries shame, where he has unresolved grief, where his pride is defending an old wound, where his desire for control is masking fear of helplessness, where his need to look strong is keeping him from becoming strong in a deeper sense. This is why emotional honesty is not optional in awakening. It is essential. A man cannot become sacred while remaining emotionally dishonest with himself. He cannot become trustworthy while living in chronic avoidance. He cannot hold deep love while refusing deep self-knowledge. He cannot lead with integrity while parts of him remain underground and unexamined. Eventually, he must descend into the places he avoided, into the grief he minimized, into the memories he outran, into the fear he covered with pride, into the loneliness he kept trying to medicate with stimulation, into the tenderness he buried because it once felt unsafe. This descent is not weakness. It is courage in one of its purest forms. The world often teaches men to prove courage outwardly. Compete, win, endure, dominate, provide, protect. All of those may matter. But some of the greatest courage a man will ever need is inward. The courage to stop running from himself. The courage to name what hurts. The courage to admit that emotional avoidance has cost him something precious. The courage to grieve the years spent calling numbness maturity. The courage to learn a new way of being strong. Because there is a new way. A stronger way. A strength that does not depend on emotional paralysis. A strength that can say, "I am affected, but I will not abandon myself." A strength that can apologize without collapse. A strength that can receive feedback without rage. A strength that can love deeply without using distance as a weapon. A strength that can endure uncertainty without becoming cruel or cold. This is the strength of the awakened masculine. He is not less steady because he feels. He is more steady because he is no longer split against himself. He is not less powerful because he softens. He is more powerful because softness is no longer frightening to him. He is not less disciplined because he faces sorrow. He is more disciplined because he no longer wastes energy suppressing what needs to be understood. And when a man reaches this place, something profound changes. His relationships change because people can finally feel where he really is. His decisions change because he is no longer being unconsciously driven by buried reactions. His presence changes because there is less tension between what he feels and what he shows. His intimacy changes because closeness no longer feels like a threat to identity. His spirituality changes because truth can finally travel through parts of him that were once sealed shut. This is freedom. Not the freedom of avoidance. Not the freedom of pretending not to care. Not the freedom of staying untouched. A deeper freedom. The freedom of no longer being afraid of one's own humanity. And perhaps that is what many men have been longing for all along, though they lack the words to say it. Not freedom from feeling, but freedom within feeling. Not escape from emotional life, but mastery that includes it. Not control through suppression, but order through truth. That is what awakens the divine masculine. Not emotional avoidance. Not polished detachment. Not the ability to look calm while privately falling apart. But the courage to enter the inner world with honesty, to remain there without flinching, and to come back carrying a strength that is no longer borrowed from numbness. Because in the end, emotional avoidance is not strength. It is simply the refusal of a deeper initiation. And the man who finally stops refusing it begins, at last, to become real. Chapter 7. Sacred intimacy requires discipline, not just passion. There is a reason so many connections begin with fire and end in ash. At first, everything feels undeniable. The chemistry is strong. The conversations flow. The energy is magnetic. There is longing, curiosity, emotional intensity, attraction, the sense that something rare is happening. Two people feel pulled toward each other, and in that pull, it is easy to believe that passion alone will be enough. Easy to believe that because the feelings are powerful, the connection must be sustainable. Easy to believe that desire, sincerity, and spiritual language will somehow carry two people across the deeper demands of love. But sacred intimacy does not survive on passion alone. It requires discipline. And this is one of the hardest truths for the sleeping masculine to accept. Because passion feels alive. Discipline feels costly. Passion gives. Discipline asks. Passion intoxicates. Discipline reveals. Passion can make a man feel chosen in a moment. Discipline determines whether he can become trustworthy over time. The divine masculine is not awakened merely by how deeply he feels in private. He is awakened by what he is willing to govern in order to protect what is sacred. That is what discipline really is. Not punishment. Not emotional coldness. Not the death of spontaneity. Discipline is devotion with structure. It is the ability to remain aligned when the moment no longer flatters him. It is the refusal to betray what is precious simply because discomfort has entered the room. It is the strength to act from conviction instead of impulse. It is the willingness to build a container strong enough to hold love without spilling it through inconsistency, ego, distraction, or appetite. Without discipline, even beautiful love becomes unstable. A man may feel deeply and still behave carelessly. He may long intensely and still remain unreliable. He may speak about soul connection, destiny, spiritual alignment, divine timing, and profound intimacy, yet still lack the habits, honesty, restraint, and inner order required to embody those words. This is why passion alone is never proof of maturity. A man can be passionate and still be impulsive. Passionate and still evasive. Passionate and still selfish. Passionate and still emotionally immature. Passionate and still unable to hold the weight of another person's heart with clean hands. That may sound severe, but it is mercifully true. Because once a man understands this, he stops confusing emotional intensity with moral readiness. He begins to see that the real question is not merely, how strongly do I feel? The real question is, what kind of man do my feelings make me when they are tested? That question changes everything. Because feelings are easy when the connection is effortless. Desire is easy when the moment is thrilling. Tenderness is easy when admiration is flowing. Presence is easier when there is no conflict, no demand, no uncertainty, no mirror exposing weakness. But sacred intimacy begins to reveal itself when love costs something. Can he stay truthful when honesty may expose his fear? Can he stay consistent when distraction offers easier relief? Can he honor a boundary without turning cold? Can he carry desire without letting it rule him? Can he remain emotionally responsible when closeness touches his wounds? Can he protect trust even when his ego feels threatened? This is where discipline becomes holy. Because discipline is what turns love from a feeling into a vessel. Without a vessel, even pure water is lost. A man may have deep feelings, but if he lacks discipline, those feelings leak everywhere. They leak through mixed signals, through inconsistency, through half-promises, through emotional reactivity, through delayed communication, through indulgence in temptation, through the inability to stay rooted when intensity gives way to reality. Then the very love he claims to value becomes injured by his lack of inner structure. This is why sacred intimacy is not merely about chemistry. It is about stewardship. A sacred connection is not something a man merely experiences. It is something he must learn to carry. And carrying requires training. Consider the difference between fire in the open and fire in a hearth. Both are fire. Both have energy. Both can warm. But one is contained, directed, purposeful. The other can quickly become destructive. Passion without discipline is like open flame. It may look beautiful in the dark, but it does not know where to stop. It can consume the very thing it wants to enjoy. Discipline gives passion form. It does not kill the fire. It teaches the fire where to live. This is a lesson many men resist because they equate discipline with restriction. They think that if love becomes disciplined, it will lose its magic. If desire becomes governed, it will lose its intensity. If intimacy asks for structure, responsibility, and self-command, then somehow it has become less romantic, less alive, less real. But the opposite is true. Undisciplined passion burns hot and dies quickly. Disciplined love deepens. Undisciplined desire chases experience. Disciplined desire builds trust. Undisciplined intimacy seeks emotional highs. Disciplined intimacy creates sacred safety. And safety is not boring. It is what allows depth to survive. A man cannot keep asking for profound love while resisting the discipline profound love requires. He cannot want a woman's softness while remaining careless with consistency. He cannot want spiritual union while preserving habits that divide him within himself. He cannot want to be trusted while continuing to act from moods instead of principles. He cannot want sacred intimacy while worshiping personal freedom in a way that makes devotion impossible. This is often where the sleeping masculine fractures. He wants the beauty of intimacy without the boundaries that protect it. He wants to be deeply felt without becoming deeply dependable. He wants the privilege of access without the labor of stewardship. He wants to feel close without being accountable to what closeness demands. But sacred intimacy is not built by appetite. It is built by reverence. And reverence changes behavior. When a man reveres something, he becomes careful with it. He slows down. He listens differently. He speaks more honestly. He guards what he has been given. He thinks beyond the impulse of the moment. He stops asking only what he can receive and begins asking what he must become to protect the sacredness of the exchange. This is discipline at its highest form. Not sterile control, but reverent self-governance. It is the ability to say, because this matters, I will not handle it casually. Because this is precious, I will not approach it fragmented. Because this heart is real, I will not let my mood become its weather. Because this connection is sacred, I will not use spiritual language to excuse immature behavior. Because I feel deeply, I must become even more honest, not less. This kind of masculine discipline is rare. Not because men are incapable of it, but because many have never been taught to associate discipline with intimacy. They may understand discipline in work, in fitness, in business, in competition, in external goals. They know how to wake up early, push through pain, stay focused, perform under pressure, build plans, achieve outcomes. But intimate discipline is different. It asks for inner order, not just outer success. It asks for regulation, not just performance. It asks for consistency where no audience is applauding. It asks for truthfulness when lying or delaying would be easier. It asks for restraint where indulgence would feel more immediately rewarding. It asks for humility when pride wants to defend itself. This kind of discipline is not flashy, but it is what makes a man safe to love. And that matters. Because one of the deepest needs in sacred intimacy is not merely attraction. It is safety born from integrity. Not the safety of boredom. Not the safety of emotional flatness. Not the safety of never being challenged. The safety of knowing that the man before you is governed by something deeper than impulse. That his word has weight. That his affection is not random. That his attention is not easily bought by novelty. That his desire is not separated from his discernment. That when he says something matters, his habits will eventually prove it. This is what discipline creates. Credibility. Without discipline, a man may still be charming, emotional, spiritually articulate, and deeply moving in isolated moments. But over time, his lack of structure will erode trust. The other person will feel the instability, even if she cannot name it immediately. She will sense that his words run ahead of his character, that his feelings are sincere, but not governed, that his tenderness is real, but not yet protected by enough integrity to become a foundation. And eventually, sincerity without discipline becomes painful, because it keeps offering glimpses of what could be, while repeatedly failing to embody what is needed. This is why many men are shocked when passion does not save the connection. They think, but I felt so much. And perhaps they did. But feeling much is not the same as building well. A cathedral is not made of emotion alone. It is made of devotion repeated with precision. So is sacred intimacy. It is built in the daily choices. In whether he communicates when silence would create confusion. In whether he tells the truth before being forced to. In whether he can bear frustration without becoming cruel or avoidant. In whether he honors boundaries when desire is strong. In whether he resists temptations that would fracture trust. In whether he returns, repairs, clarifies, apologizes, and stands upright when reality stops feeling poetic. These are deeply spiritual acts. Because the sleeping masculine often lives by emotional weather. He is steady when he feels inspired. Present when he feels connected. Warm when he feels safe. Generous when he feels admired. Open when vulnerability is not being asked of him. But the awakened masculine learns to live by vow, not mood. Not necessarily literal vow at first, but inward vow. The vow to remain honorable even when he is uncomfortable. The vow to tell the truth even when it costs him image. The vow to restrain his lower impulses when something sacred is at stake. The vow to practice consistency because love deserves more than spontaneity. The vow to stop treating intimacy like a place to express himself and start treating it like a place to refine himself. That is a profound shift. And it leads to a deeper question. What is the point of passion if it cannot survive contact with discipline? If desire disappears the moment restraint is required, was it love or merely appetite? If intimacy collapses the moment accountability enters, was it sacred or simply stimulating? If his feelings vanish whenever clarity is demanded, were they rooted in truth or in emotional convenience? These questions can feel confronting, but they are necessary. Because the divine masculine awakens precisely when he realizes that the highest form of love is not ungoverned expression. It is governed devotion. It is not how loudly he can feel. It is how faithfully he can hold. To hold a heart. To hold a promise. To hold himself. To hold his energy. To hold the line between desire and destruction. To hold his presence when the old version of him wants to run. This is discipline. And yes, it costs him something. It costs impulsiveness. It costs the fantasy of unlimited freedom. It costs the ego's demand to act only when it feels like acting. It costs immature habits that once allowed him to stay fragmented without consequence. But what it gives him is far greater. It gives him self-respect. It gives him clarity. It gives him depth that does not evaporate under pressure. It gives him the ability to create emotional safety without becoming weak. It gives him the capacity to love without chaos. It gives him the dignity of being a man whose inner life is ordered enough to protect what he values. And perhaps most importantly, it gives him continuity. He is no longer a man of isolated, profound moments. He becomes a man of sustained sacred presence. That is what separates passion from devotion. Passion says, I feel this now. Discipline says, I will honor what is true even when now becomes difficult. Passion says, you move me. Discipline says, I will not let being moved become an excuse for carelessness. Passion says, this is powerful. Discipline says, because it is powerful, I must handle it rightly. This is the language of the awakened masculine. Not less romantic. More real. Not colder. More trustworthy. Not passionless. More integrated. Because sacred intimacy was never meant to be sustained by attraction alone. Attraction may open the door, but discipline keeps the house standing. And when a man understands that, truly understands it, something in him matures. He stops searching only for a love that feels intense. He begins becoming a man who can make love feel safe, clean, consistent, and spiritually inhabitable. He becomes less interested in being overwhelmed by emotion and more committed to becoming worthy of what emotion has revealed. He stops asking only for a deep connection and starts building the internal architecture that can actually hold one. He realizes that the most intimate thing he can offer is not merely desire. It is disciplined presence. Because in the end, sacred intimacy requires more than passion. It requires a man who can govern himself so that love does not have to suffer from his lack of order. And when he finally accepts that, not as a burden but as an honor, the divine masculine rises to a new level. No longer just stirred by feeling. Now shaped by devotion. No longer merely capable of intensity. Now capable of stewardship. No longer in love with the fire alone. Now ready to become the hearth. Chapter 8. He must lose the illusion before he finds his power. There are some truths a man will never accept while his illusions are still working. As long as the mask still earns admiration, he will be tempted to keep wearing it. As long as avoidance still protects him from discomfort, he will call it peace. As long as desire still distracts him from emptiness, he will call it freedom. As long as charm still opens doors, he will resist the deeper labor of character. As long as performance still gets rewarded, he will struggle to believe that something essential in him remains asleep. This is why awakening so often begins with loss. Not because loss is wholly by itself. Not because pain is automatically transformative. Not because suffering makes a man profound. But because illusion rarely dies politely. Usually it has to fail. And when it fails, the man who was relying on it is suddenly brought face to face with a version of himself he can no longer edit. This is one of the most painful turning points in the awakening of the divine masculine. The moment when what once seemed to protect him begins to expose him. The moment when the very strategies that gave him a sense of power suddenly stop working. The moment when he realizes that what he built his identity on cannot carry the full weight of his soul. He may lose a relationship. He may lose an image. He may lose access to someone who once reflected beauty back to him. He may lose the emotional high that kept him from feeling his own fragmentation. He may lose the role, the status, the story, the certainty, the illusion that he was more whole than he actually was. And in that loss, something in him breaks open. This is not a small event. Because most men do not simply lose circumstances. They lose explanations. The explanations they used to maintain control. The explanations that allowed them to stay unexamined. The explanations that turned fear into standards, avoidance into wisdom, detachment into maturity, and emotional confusion into complexity. When those explanations collapse, a man is left with a devastating question. Who am I without the illusions that made me feel powerful? That question is terrifying. Especially for a man who has spent years identifying with forms of false power. The power of being desired. The power of staying emotionally unavailable. The power of never needing too much. The power of keeping options open. The power of being difficult to read. The power of maintaining control through silence, distance, mystery, or charisma. These things can feel powerful for a time. But they are not the same as real power. Real power does not depend on keeping people uncertain. Real power does not depend on avoiding vulnerability. Real power does not depend on being untouchable. Real power does not depend on preserving image at all costs. Real power comes from alignment, from being a man whose inner life and outer life are no longer at war, from no longer needing illusion in order to feel valuable, from no longer borrowing identity from reactions, admiration, appetite, or control, from standing in truth even when truth strips away everything false. But very few men arrive there without first passing through a kind of death. Not a physical death, an ego death, a symbolic death, the death of false identities, the death of old defenses, the death of the man he thought he was. This death often feels like humiliation, not because he is being degraded, but because he can no longer maintain the fantasy that he was in control all along. He may realize that he did care more than he admitted, that he did need more than he pretended, that he was more wounded than he allowed himself to see, that he was not as free as he claimed to be, that what he called choice was sometimes compulsion, that what he called strength was often self-protection, that what he called wisdom was often fear dressed in noble language. These realizations can be crushing, because a man may look back and suddenly see the trail of illusion through his own life. The relationships he mishandled because ego was still in charge. The moments he withdrew instead of telling the truth. The times he chose power over tenderness, distance over honesty, stimulation over depth, self-protection over sacred responsibility. He may begin to see that many of the things he once trusted in himself were not as pure as he believed. That kind of seeing hurts. But it is also mercy. Because what is illusion except a lie the soul has grown tired of carrying? And when the soul grows tired enough, life begins to cooperate with truth. The old pattern stops satisfying. The old pleasure stops numbing. The old strategy stops working. The old image starts to feel heavy. The old self begins to feel intolerable. This is often the beginning of collapse. And collapse, though frightening, is not always destruction. Sometimes it is revelation. A building that collapses because its foundation was false has not been ruined by truth. It has been exposed by it. The same is true within a man. If a relationship collapses because he could not sustain honesty, the collapse is revealing something. If his inner peace collapses when admiration is removed, that reveals something. If his identity collapses the moment he is no longer desired, no longer chosen, no longer in control, that reveals something. The revelation is painful but sacred, because the divine masculine cannot be built on a false foundation. It cannot be built on seduction. It cannot be built on image. It cannot be built on numbed-out success. It cannot be built on partial truth. It cannot be built on the fantasy that a man can remain divided and still become powerful. Sooner or later, reality interrupts fantasy. And when it does, the man who wants to awaken has a choice. He can rush to rebuild the illusion. Find a new distraction. A new person. A new goal. A new source of validation. A new way to feel superior instead of surrendered. Or he can remain in the rubble long enough to learn. This second path is the harder one. It is also the holier one. Because the rubble tells the truth. It tells him what could not stand. It tells him where he was over-identified. It tells him what he worshipped. It tells him what he used for power that had no power to save him. It tells him where he mistook false strength for real capacity. To remain in the rubble is to resist the urge to immediately reinflate the ego. It is to sit in the discomfort of not having an elegant story yet. Not rushing to say, it was meant to happen, before he has actually faced why it happened. Not hiding behind spiritual language to avoid personal accountability. Not calling the collapse divine timing while refusing to examine the parts of him that were immature, dishonest, fearful, or unformed. This kind of honesty is rare. Many people want transformation without ruin. Awakening without humiliation. Depth without exposure. Power without surrender. But the path of the divine masculine does not usually move that way. It asks a man to let the false die. And the false does not die painlessly. It resists. It bargains. It rationalizes. It says, This is not that serious. It says, you were just protecting yourself. It says, you did your best. It says, they expected too much. It says, you can fix this by moving on quickly. Sometimes those thoughts contain partial truth. But partial truth, when used to avoid full truth, becomes another illusion. An illusion is the very thing that must die. A man finds his real power only when he stops protecting what is false in him. That sentence matters deeply. Not when he becomes perfect. Not when he gains more influence. Not when he learns better tactics. Not when he becomes more admired. He finds his power when he can finally say, without flinching, yes, that was ego. Yes, that was fear. Yes, that was avoidance. Yes, I was manipulating perception. Yes, I wanted something sacred without being ready to honor it. Yes, I called myself strong while refusing the initiation that real strength required. This is not self-hatred. It is self-confrontation. And self-confrontation is one of the highest forms of masculine courage. Because most men would rather lose people than lose illusions. They would rather defend the image than dismantle it. They would rather stay half awake than endure the grief of seeing how asleep they really were. But the man who is ready for awakening becomes willing to endure that grief. He grieves the false self, the younger patterns, the borrowed identities, the wasted years, the opportunities mishandled by emotional immaturity, the love he may have touched but failed to hold rightly, the version of manhood he inherited that taught him how to appear strong without becoming whole. This grief is not weakness. It is purification. Because grief empties out what pride keeps full. Grief breaks open what ego keeps defended. Grief softens the inner ground so that something truer can finally be planted. And once illusion begins to die, a new kind of power becomes possible. A quieter power. A cleaner power. A power that does not need witnesses in order to feel real. The power to tell the truth before being forced to. The power to stay present when shame rises. The power to take responsibility without collapsing into self-pity. The power to live without needing to be constantly reassured of worth. The power to remain open-hearted without becoming naive. The power to walk in integrity even when no one is rewarding it yet. This is not flashy power. It is foundational power. And foundational power changes everything. Because a man who has lost illusion becomes harder to deceive, especially by himself. He starts recognizing the old seductions more quickly. The urge to perform. The urge to disappear. The urge to seek validation instead of meaning. The urge to confuse fantasy with destiny. The urge to rebuild identity through outer reactions rather than inner truth. But now he sees. And seeing is a form of freedom. He is no longer trapped by the things he once called power. He begins to understand that false power always needs maintenance. It depends on conditions, on appearance, on control, on being desired, on being impressive, on never looking weak. Real power, by contrast, survives exposure. In fact, it grows through exposure. Because what is real does not need illusion to stand. This is why many of the strongest men are not the men who never broke. They are the men who broke honestly. The men who let collapse become consecration. The men who stopped worshiping the version of themselves that could survive shallowly and started becoming the version that could live deeply. The men who passed through humiliation and came out humbler, cleaner, and less divided. That is power. Not the ability to dominate. The ability to remain true. Not the ability to keep everything. The ability to lose what was false and still rise. Not the ability to avoid pain. The ability to let pain instruct rather than harden. And perhaps that is why so many awakenings begin in the very moments a man thinks he is losing everything. Because what he is really losing is illusion. The illusion that he was whole without inner work. The illusion that desire could replace depth. The illusion that performance could sustain intimacy. The illusion that avoidance was peace. The illusion that being wanted was the same as being worthy. The illusion that control was power. Once these die, he stands in a frightening but sacred emptiness. An emptiness where the old self no longer fits. An emptiness where excuses sound thin. An emptiness where there is no more hiding. An emptiness where he must either become real or rebuild the lie. This is the threshold. And the man who chooses truth at this threshold begins to discover something astonishing. He is not less powerful without the illusion. He is more powerful because he no longer needs it. He no longer needs to be the most desired. He no longer needs to be unreadable. He no longer needs to be above pain. He no longer needs to look unaffected. He no longer needs to preserve identities that keep him from intimacy, humility, and honest growth. He can finally be a man. Not a fantasy. Not a performance. Not a shell defended by cleverness and charm. A man whose power comes from what has survived the fire of truth. And that is the paradox at the heart of masculine awakening. He must lose before he finds. He must be exposed before he can be aligned. He must let the false die before the sacred can stand. He must watch illusion collapse before he can discover the kind of power that does not collapse with it. This is not punishment. It is initiation. Because the divine masculine does not emerge from the preservation of illusion. It emerges from the courage to let illusion burn, and to remain in the fire long enough for something eternal to be revealed underneath. Chapter 9. The divine masculine awakens when he chooses purpose over possession. There comes a moment in every true masculine awakening when a man must decide what kind of power he actually wants. Not the power to attract. Not the power to influence. Not the power to keep someone emotionally attached. Not the power to remain unforgettable in another person's story. A deeper power than that. The power to become. This is the turning point where the divine masculine begins to separate himself from the boyhood patterns that once defined him. Because an unawakened man often approaches life, love, and even spirituality through the lens of possession. He may not always say it directly. He may not even consciously realize it. But beneath many of his choices is the same question. How do I keep what makes me feel powerful? How do I keep her attention? How do I keep her softness? How do I keep her admiration? How do I keep the connection without surrendering too much of myself? How do I keep the benefits of intimacy without being fully transformed by its demands? These are the subtle questions of possession. And possession is one of the last strongholds of the sleeping masculine. Because possession is not only about controlling a woman. It is about controlling reality in a way that protects the ego. It is about trying to hold people, outcomes, identities, and emotional experiences in forms that serve self-image more than truth. It is about asking, in one way or another, how can I have this without having to become more honest, more disciplined, more surrendered, more aligned? This is why possession can hide beneath even the most romantic language. A man may say he wants love, but what he may really want is emotional reassurance. He may say he wants union, but what he may really want is the feeling of being deeply significant to someone. He may say he wants commitment, but what he may really want is guaranteed access without inward refinement. He may say he wants intimacy, but what he may really want is the comfort of being wanted while still preserving control. Until he confronts this, he remains asleep in a very important way. Because the divine masculine is not awakened through ownership. It is awakened through purpose. And purpose changes the entire structure of desire. Possession asks, how can I keep? Purpose asks, who am I becoming? Possession asks, how do I make this stay? Purpose asks, what is life asking me to build? Possession asks, how do I preserve my emotional advantage? Purpose asks, how do I become worthy of the sacred trust one say I desire? Possession is concerned with securing an outcome. Purpose is concerned with sanctifying the man. That difference is everything. Because when a man is still ruled by possession, he will always be unstable in love. He will be too reactive to loss, too dependent on validation, too threatened by distance, too tempted to manipulate, too likely to interpret another person's autonomy as an assault on his worth. He will confuse longing with entitlement. He will confuse impact with destiny. He will confuse being deeply affected by someone with having the right to keep them near. But love does not ripen in entitlement. Love ripens in stewardship. And stewardship is born from purpose. A purposeful man does not relate to life as a collector of experiences, people, and emotional highs. He begins to relate to life as a builder of character, a builder of order, a builder of integrity, a builder of a soul capable of carrying both responsibility and tenderness without collapsing into ego or appetite. This is why choosing purpose over possession is such a radical act. It means that when a man encounters something beautiful, he does not immediately ask how to secure it. He asks what this beauty is calling forth in him. It means that when he feels love, he does not only ask how to be loved back. He asks what kind of man he must become if he is to hold love with clean hands. It means that when he loses someone, he does not only ask how to get them back. He asks what the loss has revealed about the areas where he still lacked truth, strength, discipline, or presence. It means that when desire rises, he does not only ask how to satisfy it. He asks whether the path before him serves his becoming or merely feeds his hunger. This is the architecture of awakened masculinity. Because purpose places a man in right relationship with his energy. Without purpose, masculine energy becomes restless. It becomes acquisitive. It becomes overly preoccupied with getting, securing, proving, achieving, obtaining, conquering. Even when those efforts are outwardly successful, there is often a strange instability underneath. A man may have many things and still feel internally homeless. He may receive attention and still feel unseen. He may gain influence and still feel spiritually thin. Why? Because masculine energy was never meant to revolve around possession alone. It was meant to be directed toward mission. Mission is what gathers a man. Mission is what orders desire. Mission is what gives suffering meaning. Mission is what stops him from making another person the center of his identity. Mission is what rescues love from becoming obsession. This matters deeply in intimate relationships. A man without purpose often places too much metaphysical weight on the woman. She becomes not simply loved, but tasked with organizing his inner world. Her presence determines his emotional climate. Her affection becomes proof of worth. Her distance becomes collapse. Her approval becomes medicine. Her mystery becomes fixation. This is too much pressure for any human being to carry. No woman, no matter how loving, no matter how spiritually attuned, no matter how beautiful her heart, was designed to become the axis around which a man's soul rotates. That place belongs to truth, to God, to purpose, to the sacred work of becoming. When a man forgets this, love becomes distorted. He reaches for possession because he lacks inner direction. He becomes preoccupied with holding on to the person because he has not yet anchored himself in the path. But when purpose enters, his whole posture changes. He can love deeply without making love his idol. He can honor beauty without trying to trap it. He can cherish connection without letting it replace his mission. He can experience longing without becoming enslaved by it. He can feel grief without losing his center. This is real masculine power. Not detachment. Not coldness. Not indifference. Direction. There is something profoundly attractive and profoundly sacred about a man who is directed. Not a man who is merely busy. Not a man who is compulsively ambitious for the sake of external success. But a man whose life is ordered around something higher than appetite. A man who knows that his existence is not just for self-gratification, self-protection, or self-display. A man who senses that he has been entrusted with strength for a reason. That reason is not to accumulate. It is to serve what is worthy. And serving what is worthy requires sacrifice. This is why many men avoid full awakening. Because purpose costs them the fantasy of possession. If he chooses purpose, he can no longer build his life around temporary emotional control. He can no longer treat women as mirrors for his ego. He can no longer pursue connection while resisting the personal discipline connection demands. He can no longer mistake being desired for being aligned. He can no longer confuse access with intimacy. He can no longer center his life around what flatters him instead of what forms him. Purpose strips away these lesser loyalties. And that stripping can feel like loss at first. A man may realize that many of his previous desires were not wrong in themselves, but disordered. He may see that he wanted closeness more than truth. He may see that he wanted emotional certainty more than inner transformation. He may see that he wanted someone to affirm his greatness, while he was still avoiding the furnace that greatness requires. This realization can humble him deeply. Because purpose is not a decorative idea. It is a refining fire. It asks a man, what are you building that will outlast your moods? What are you giving your strength to? What part of your life reflects your sacred calling instead of your private cravings? Where are you wasting power? Where are you demanding from love what only purpose can provide? Where are you trying to possess what life is asking you to honor? These questions mature a man. And maturity is what makes sacred union possible. Because a man ruled by possession cannot truly love cleanly. Some part of his love will always be tangled with fear, ego, dependency, or control. He may care sincerely, but he will still be reaching. Still trying to secure himself through the other person. Still trying to stabilize his identity through what he can keep. But the purposeful man loves differently. He does not love from emptiness. He loves from alignment. He does not reach for a woman to complete the structure of his soul. He invites her into a life already submitted to truth. He does not make her responsible for his direction. He shares direction with clarity. He does not ask her to carry the meaning of his existence. He honors her as a gift, not a substitute for his mission. He does not hold her through control. He holds the relationship through integrity. This changes the emotional tone of everything. His love becomes less panicked, less grasping, less manipulative, less theatrical, less dependent on reassurance. And in its place emerges something stronger. Reverence, steadiness, focused devotion, the ability to choose rather than cling, the ability to bless rather than consume, the ability to release what is not his without collapsing into bitterness. That last part is especially important. A man who chooses purpose over possession eventually learns one of the deepest truths of masculine awakening. Not everything beautiful is meant to be owned. Some things are meant to awaken him, refine him, direct him, humble him, or reveal him. Some people enter his life not to become trophies of his emotional significance, but to become turning points in his formation. If he insists on possession, he will miss the lesson. If he chooses purpose, he will receive the transformation. This is why loss becomes different in the life of an awakened man. Loss is no longer only deprivation. It becomes instruction. A closed door becomes redirection. A heartbreak becomes revelation. A failed relationship becomes a mirror. A longing he cannot fulfill becomes an altar on which lesser versions of himself are burned away. This does not mean he feels nothing. It does not mean purpose erases sorrow. But it means sorrow no longer has the final word. Because purpose gives grief a container. It gives pain a direction. It gives the masculine heart something stronger to kneel before than its own wounded need to keep what it cannot control. That is why the divine masculine becomes powerful when he chooses purpose. Not because he becomes invulnerable, but because he stops organizing his life around what can be possessed and starts organizing it around what can be built. He builds character where there was once only charm. He builds discipline where there was once only desire. He builds truth where there was once only image. He builds steadiness where there was once only intensity. He builds service where there was once only self-concern. He builds mission where there was once only restless longing. And in that building, he becomes a different kind of man. A man who is not always asking, how do I get? But asking, how do I serve? Not asking, how do I keep? But asking, how do I honor? Not asking, how do I remain central in her heart? But asking, how do I remain faithful to the sacred work my life has been entrusted with? This is a higher masculinity. A masculinity no longer hypnotized by possession. A masculinity freed from the smallness of trying to secure worth through control. A masculinity brave enough to accept that love is not a means of self-glorification. It is a context in which truth is either embodied or betrayed. And once a man truly sees this, his desires begin to change. He still wants love, but he wants it cleanly. He still wants intimacy, but he no longer wants it at the expense of his soul. He still feels longing, but longing no longer rules him. He still grieves, but grief no longer defines him. He still values deep connection, but he no longer treats connection as his highest God. He becomes inwardly ordered. And inward order is one of the clearest signs that the divine masculine is waking up. Because the awakened man is no longer desperate to possess. He is devoted to purpose. He knows that if love comes, he must be ready to honor it. He knows that if love leaves, he must still remain faithful to the work of becoming. He knows that his life cannot be built on chasing emotional certainty. It must be built on living in truth, carrying responsibility, and directing his strength toward what is eternal. This is not a small shift. It is a rebirth. The old masculine asks, "How do I hold on to what makes me feel alive?" The awakened masculine asks, "How do I become the kind of man whose life itself becomes an offering?" That question marks the difference between possession and purpose. And only one of them can wake the soul. Because in the end, the divine masculine does not fully rise when a man gets what he wants. He rises when he becomes devoted to what he was made for. Chapter 10. The man who wakes up changes everything. There is a moment, quiet and almost invisible, when a man begins to realize that awakening is not an idea anymore. It is no longer a philosophy he admires. No longer a language he borrows. No longer a mood he visits when he feels reflective, wounded, inspired, or spiritually intense. It becomes a way of being. And when that happens, everything changes. Not all at once. Not in some dramatic cinematic instant where every wound closes and every answer appears. But steadily, deeply, irreversibly. Because once a man truly wakes up, he cannot return to sleep in the same way. He may still struggle. He may still grieve. He may still face old temptations, old fears, old patterns that try to pull him back into familiar shadows. But something fundamental has shifted. He has seen too much. He has felt too much truth. He has recognized too clearly the cost of living divided. He has touched the difference between false power and real power. And because of that, he can no longer fully belong to the version of himself that once lived by illusion. This is what makes masculine awakening so powerful. It does not merely improve a man. It reorders him. His relationship with himself changes first. He stops living as his own performance manager. Stops curating his image as if appearance were the highest form of safety. Stops measuring worth by attention, conquest, admiration, or emotional control. Stops calling avoidance peace. Stops calling numbness discipline. Stops calling ego strength. Instead, he begins to live with a deeper kind of honesty. He notices himself sooner. He catches the old reflex before it becomes action. He feels the urge to withdraw, but instead of romanticizing it, he questions it. He feels the urge to control, but instead of obeying it automatically, he examines it. He feels desire, but no longer mistakes desire for authority. He feels fear, but no longer bows to it as if fear were wisdom. This is one of the clearest marks of an awakened man. He becomes internally governed. Not by repression. Not by rigidity. Not by dead emotional restraint. By truth. Truth begins to sit at the center of him like a throne he no longer tries to overthrow. And when truth sits at the center, everything around it must come into right order. His words change. Not just in style, but in substance. He becomes more careful with what he promises. More honest about what he can and cannot carry. More willing to speak plainly instead of hiding behind ambiguity. More able to say, "I was wrong." More able to say, "I am not there yet." More able to say, "This matters." More able to say, "I see the pattern, and I will no longer pretend I do not." The awakened masculine does not become louder. It becomes clearer. That clarity is powerful because it removes confusion from his presence. People no longer have to constantly decode him. No longer have to live in the weather of his unprocessed emotions. No longer have to wonder whether his depth is real or merely verbal. No longer have to interpret mixed signals and call them mystery. He becomes understandable. And that is not a loss of depth. It is evidence of maturity. Immature masculinity often hides inside complexity. Mature masculinity becomes coherent. This coherence begins to change his relationships. Not because awakening makes every relationship easy, but because it changes the quality of what he brings into them. He stops seeking connection mainly for validation. Stops needing another person to organize his identity. Stops approaching love as a place to get relief from himself. Stops asking intimacy to fix what only truth, discipline, and spiritual alignment can heal. So when he loves differently. He listens more fully. He reacts less impulsively. He stays longer in difficult conversations. He becomes less fragile in the face of honest feedback. He stops turning every moment of vulnerability into a threat to his masculinity. He begins to understand that strength is not proven by how untouched he remains, but by how responsibly he shows up when something real is at stake. This makes him safer. Safe not because he is perfect. Safe because he is accountable. Safe because he is no longer loyal to confusion. Safe because he does not use silence as a weapon. Safe because he does not feed on admiration while withholding clarity. Safe because his tenderness is no longer blocked by pride. Safe because he is willing to repair what he once would have escaped. And this safety has enormous power. A grounded masculine presence changes the emotional atmosphere around it. Children feel it. Women feel it. Friends feel it. Colleagues feel it. Even strangers can often sense it. Because a man who has stopped warring with himself does not spread the same kind of unrest. He enters spaces with less hidden hunger. Less need to prove. Less need to dominate. Less need to be the center. Less need to protect an image at all costs. Instead, he brings steadiness. And steadiness is rare. In a world addicted to performance, an honest man stands out. In a culture built on stimulation, a disciplined man stands out. In an environment full of fragmented energy, a coherent man stands out. Not because he demands attention, but because integrity has weight. This is another thing awakening changes. A man begins to understand that influence is not the same as force. He no longer needs to overpower in order to affect. No longer needs to manipulate in order to matter. No longer needs to keep people slightly off balance to feel significant. His presence itself begins to teach. It teaches through restraint, through consistency, through the absence of chaos, through the refusal to participate in dishonor, through the way he handles disappointment without becoming petty, through the way he handles desire without becoming reckless, through the way he handles pain without making it everyone else's punishment. This is leadership at its most sacred form. Not theatrical leadership. Not branding. Not charisma alone. Embodied leadership. The kind that says, without words, I have gone to war with what is false in me. And because of that, what I offer now is cleaner. That cleanliness matters. Because so much damage in the world comes not from obvious evil, but from unexamined fragmentation. From men with power but no integration. Men with charm but no discipline. Men with desire but no reverence. Men with intelligence but no humility. Men with influence but no inner government. An awakened man begins to reverse that pattern. He becomes the kind of man who can hold strength without corruption, tenderness without collapse, authority without domination, depth without confusion, passion without destruction. And this changes more than his personal life. It changes what he builds. His work changes because he is no longer driven only by hunger. He begins to create from purpose instead of compensation. He stops trying to prove he matters and starts trying to serve what matters. He brings more integrity into decisions, more patience into process, more moral courage into leadership, more care into what he leaves behind. The awakened masculine does not just want success. It wants consecration. That is a very different desire. Success asks, how far can I go? Consecration asks, what am I becoming as I go there? Success can be measured from the outside. Consecration is measured by alignment. A man who wakes up begins caring deeply about that alignment. He wants his outer life to match his inner claims. He wants his speech to match his behavior. He wants his values to survive contact with temptation. He wants his spirituality to live in his habits, not only in his vocabulary. He wants his love to be embodied, not merely felt. This is why awakening can look less glamorous than people expect. It often looks like smaller promises and greater faithfulness. Fewer grand speeches and more daily integrity. Less dramatic intensity and more durable presence. Less obsession with being perceived as profound and more commitment to becoming trustworthy. But these quieter changes are the most revolutionary. Because they endure. Anyone can have moments. Not everyone can build a life. The awakened man begins to build a life. A life that can hold grief without becoming cynical. A life that can hold love without making love an idol. A life that can hold longing without turning longing into self-destruction. A life that can hold purpose without becoming cold. A life that can hold responsibility without losing tenderness. This is what makes his awakening ripple outward. The man who wakes up changes the emotional inheritance of the people around him. If he becomes a father, he gives his children a different model of strength. If he becomes a partner, he gives love a different container. If he becomes a friend, he gives loyalty a different texture. If he becomes a leader, he gives power a different moral center. And even if no one ever praises him for it, the change still matters. Because integrity always matters. Because truth always matters. Because one less divided man in the world is not a small thing. One less man using pain as an excuse for harm. One less man using silence as a shield for immaturity. One less man using desire as a substitute for devotion. One less man calling ego masculinity. One less man abandoning himself when life demands depth. That matters immensely. And perhaps this is the deepest truth of all. When a man wakes up, he does not only save himself from a smaller life. He becomes a blessing. Not in a sentimental sense. In a real sense. He becomes more capable of protecting without controlling. Providing without pride. Leading without ego. Loving without manipulation. Serving without hidden appetite. Standing firm without becoming hard. This is the divine masculine in its ripened form. Not a costume. Not a trend. Not a seductive archetype. A man made honest by truth. A man made clean by surrender. A man made strong by responsibility. A man made deep by the willingness to descend into himself and return with integrity. But let us be clear. This awakening is not the end of struggle. It is the end of unconscious struggle. The awakened man still has to choose, again and again, what kind of life he will live. Still has to notice pride when it rises. Still has to govern desire. Still has to tell the truth when lying would be easier. Still has to remain faithful when distraction calls. Still has to choose purpose over possession, responsibility over reaction, character over image. But now he chooses knowingly. And that is the difference. Before awakening, he was often led by patterns he did not fully understand. After awakening, he becomes increasingly able to lead himself. This is freedom. Not freedom to do whatever he feels. Freedom from being ruled by what once mastered him. Freedom from performance. Freedom from illusion. Freedom from the need to possess in order to feel powerful. Freedom from the exhausting maintenance of false identities. Freedom from the lie that masculinity requires disconnection from the heart. He becomes available to a greater life. A life in which strength and softness no longer have to compete. A life in which devotion is not weakness. A life in which truth is not a threat. A life in which love can be honored because the man himself has become more honorable. And maybe that is the real miracle. Not that he finds perfect love. Not that he never suffers again. Not that every relationship works out the way he hoped, but that he becomes a man capable of meeting life without betrayal of soul. That is awakening. That is power. That is the kind of masculinity the world is starving for. So if there is a man listening to this who recognizes himself in these chapters, in the performance, in the avoidance, in the hunger, in the illusion, in the fear of being seen, in the ache of knowing he was made for more, then let this be the moment he stops romanticizing delay. Let this be the moment he tells the truth. Not tomorrow. Not when life becomes easier. Not when the perfect relationship arrives. Not when pain forces him into it again. Now. Because the man he is meant to become will not be built by accident. He will be built by courage. By honesty. By grief rightly carried. By discipline. By sacred confrontation. By surrender to a truth deeper than ego. You do not need to become a different species of man. You need to become a more truthful one. You do not need more performance. You need more alignment. You do not need to look invincible. You need to become real. And once you become real, everything changes. Not all at once, but enough. Deeply enough. Truly enough. Forever enough. Because the man who wakes up changes everything. He changes the way he loves. He changes the way he leads. He changes the way he suffers. He changes the way he speaks. He changes the way he chooses. He changes the atmosphere of every room his integrity enters. And most importantly, he changes the story. The story inherited by boys who thought they had to harden to survive. The story inherited by men who were taught to perform instead of feel. The story inherited by relationships starved for steadiness. The story inherited by a culture that keeps confusing power with dominance and masculinity with emotional exile. The awakened man breaks that story. And in breaking it, he becomes free. Closing message. So let this be your reminder. You were never created merely to impress, to chase, to hide, to dominate, or to survive behind a mask. You were created to become grounded enough to carry truth, strong enough to protect what is sacred, honest enough to face yourself, disciplined enough to honor love, humble enough to let illusion die, purposeful enough to build a life that reflects the deepest call on your soul. That is the path. That is the invitation. That is the awakening. And once you answer it, your life will never be ordinary again. If this message spoke to something deep in you, write, "I choose awakening" in the comments. And if there is one truth from this video that hit you the hardest, share it below. Subscribe for more content on divine masculine awakening, spiritual discipline, sacred love, and inner transformation. And send this video to someone who is ready to rise into the man he was truly meant to be.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.